Ban started crying and said, "I thought since you greeted me this morning it meant that everything was okay." Seeing Ban's crying face, Dan couldn't ask her any more questions. Instead, she put on a fake smile and said, "Please don't cry. I am not angry at all with you, I was just a little confused, that's all." She emphasized that her feelings towards Ban hadn't changed, and it was enough to bring relief to Ban, who held on to Dan's hand. With those comforting words exchanged, the two friends reached Ban's apartment building. Ban expressed her gratitude for Dan's understanding, calling her the one and only best friend. They said their goodbyes for the day, and Dan watched Ban for a moment before heading home. Upon arriving in her room, Dan placed her bag on the bed and let out a sigh. Her fatigue from the day's events was palpable. She lay down and, in her groggy state, remembered the book she had picked up during her sleepless night. She reached out, retrieved the book, and lazily opened it. It was a web novel, and the advertising phrase on the back piqued her interest. "I kissed an unknown boy as I fell over in school. However, the boy who stole my first kiss is one of our school's 4 heavenly kings." The story, as described on the back cover, appeared typical and uninteresting to her. However, Dan couldn't ignore the glaring differences between the web novel and her current reality. Feeling perplexed, she decided to do some online research to understand the situation better. This unease grew as she searched for the 4 heavenly kings. This time, she found search results, but they weren't about the web novel. They appeared to be real-life discussions and posts about the 4 heavenly kings, who were said to be students at different schools. This discovery left Dan in a state of shock. The world around her was becoming increasingly surreal, and she couldn't grasp what was happening. She turned off her computer, leaving the unanswered questions hanging in the air. Dan tried to reassure herself, believing that everything would return to normal when she woke up. She hoped that her white uniform would be as it had always been, the strange school would disappear, and the enigmatic 4 heavenly kings would cease to exist. With that thought, she eventually drifted off to sleep. She awoke in the darkness, the soft glow of the kitchen light spilling into her room. Her mother was in the kitchen, preparing a meal. The scene felt normal, almost as if her tumultuous day had been a bizarre dream. Approaching her mother asked if something had happened at school, and Dan, struggling to find the right words to explain the day's events, responded, "Yeah, kind of." Her mother, unaware of the strangeness that had unfolded, was taken aback by her vague reply. Dan finally mustered the courage to ask the question that had been bothering her throughout the day. Dan hesitated before asking, "The super pretty new girl next door claims we've been close friends. What do you think?" "Next door," her mother considered briefly before responding, "You mean Yeoryeong, who lives next door. Do you know her?" "Of course, she's been living next door since you were born. You two have been friends forever. What's wrong with you? Did you have a fight with Yeoryeong? Is that why you're acting like you don't know her right now?" Dan was left speechless, her mind racing to make sense of her mother's words. Yeoryeong had been her neighbor and friend since her birth. The revelation was a heavy blow, and Dan retreated to her room, feeling like her reality was crumbling before her eyes. As she lay down on her bed, she couldn't help but whisper to herself, "This doesn't make sense." The inexplicable events of the day continued to confound her, and she realized that understanding her new, bewildering world would be a daunting challenge. Ban Yeoryeong and she had been friends since childhood. She knew she had to accept the reality of this parallel world she found herself in, a truth she had been denying since the very beginning. It was clear that Eun Ji-ho was the male protagonist of this unusual story. The girl destined to be the female protagonist of this web novel was undeniably Ban Yeoryeong, based on everything Dan had observed since her arrival in this new world. In the grand narrative of this novel, Dan's role seemed to be that of the girl who lived next door to Ban Yeoryeong. Dan's frustration reached its peak, and she pulled her hair in frustration. Grumbling to herself, Dan staggered over to her desk, took off a marker cap with her teeth, and wrote something on the calendar, pressing down on each letter. March 2, 2007, the day the web novel began. On that day, she made up her mind. She didn't want to be involved with Ban Yeoryeong. 3 years had passed. The next morning, as Dan lay asleep in her bed, she suddenly heard someone calling her name. The voice was oddly familiar. She opened her eyes and quickly sat up. To her surprise, it was Eun Ji-ho who was standing by her bedside. Dan blinked in disbelief and asked, "What are you doing in my bedroom?" Eun Ji-ho smirked, his usual playful self. "Your mother told me to wake you up." Dan, now thoroughly annoyed, called out for her mother, "Mom, why did you let Eun Ji-ho come into my room?" Her mother's voice came from the kitchen. I was busy, and he said he needed to wake you up, so I let him in. Eun Ji-ho, still in her room, remarked, why are you acting all shy? I've been in your room several times before. Dan blushed, feeling flustered. Do I really look the same when I'm awake and asleep? Eun Ji-ho, not missing a beat, mockingly replied, you look ugly either way. Dan, surprised at his candidness, retorted, well, you always tell Ban Yeoryeong that she's ugly, too. So does that mean we all look the same? Eun Ji-ho smirked and teased, do you really want to hear it? Annoyed, Dan ordered him to get out so she could change. Eun Ji-ho left her room, but as she got ready for the day, she knew that despite her efforts to distance herself, her life would continue to be intertwined with Ban Yeoryeong and Eun Ji-ho. Later, as she stepped out of her room, she was greeted by Ban Yeoryeong's cheerful, good morning. It was clear that her plan to stay away from Ban hadn't worked. The two friends were off to the same school, and today, they were making plans for their graduation trip together. When Dan and Ban Yeoryeong reached the subway station, they found Woo Jun and the others already waiting for them. Their reunion indicated that Dan had indeed formed a close group of friends, much like the web novel had described. Amid their joyous reunion, Dan's gaze fell on Yoo Chunyoung, who appeared rather intense. She realized that his mood was likely still affected by the earlier fight. During the train ride, Eun Ji-ho couldn't resist teasing Yoo Chunyoung about the Asian Games they had attended a few days ago, where Chun had won a bronze medal. Dan observed the interaction but felt a sudden weariness wash over her. Glancing to her side, she noticed that Ban was sound asleep, her head resting on Dan's shoulder. Her friend's peaceful slumber was contagious, and Dan soon found herself drifting off to sleep as well. With everyone asleep, Dan began to reminisce about the 3 years that were missing from her narrative. 3 years ago, Dan had been resolute in her efforts to avoid Ban Yeoryeong. She had successfully evaded their meetings until one day when a familiar voice broke her solitude with the words, "You're leaving early." Startled, she turned to see Ban Yeoryeong's brother. Dan was taken aback by the fact that someone with such striking beauty had a sibling who shared the same captivating features. She momentarily pondered the coincidence but dismissed it as just another character from a web novel. In school, Dan had tried her best to keep her distance from Ban, but her friend always managed to find a way to approach her. In one instance, as Dan was in the bathroom, a girl named Baek Yeomin approached her with a warm smile. Dan couldn't fathom why someone she had never spoken to before was suddenly engaging with her. However, the girl extended her hand and straightforwardly asked, "Want to be friends?" Realizing that this was a perfect opportunity to distance herself from Ban Yeoryeong, Dan eagerly accepted Baek Yeomin's offer of friendship. Dan's open avoidance of Ban had made her feel isolated and miserable. In another instance, Yoo Chunyoung showed his mobile phone to Ban Yeoryeong, and everyone assumed he was asking for her phone number. However, in reality, he was seeking her assistance with a problem he couldn't solve in a test. Ban Yeoryeong had achieved the top rank in the school's entrance exam. When Dan and Yeomin returned to the classroom, they noticed everyone's attention was on Chunyoung and Ban. Dan also glanced at them but quickly averted her eyes when Chunyoung noticed her, leaving him slightly irritated. When Ban Yeoryeong approached Dan to talk, Dan told her that she was busy and couldn't chat right now. Eun Ji-ho, who had been observing the situation from afar, commented that Dan was being unusually cold toward Ban. However, Woo Jun, seated beside Ji-ho, disagreed. He believed that Dan appeared more frightened and troubled in the situation than Ban Yeoryeong. A few days later, Ban Yeoryeong sat alone in her bedroom, shedding tears. Her brother came in and inquired about her well-being. She confided in him about the situation and expressed her belief that Dan no longer wanted to be friends with her. Her wise brother advised her to talk to Dan about her feelings, as they had been friends since childhood, and he was sure Dan would understand. Empowered by her brother's advice, Ban Yeoryeong headed to Dan's house. When she arrived, she saw Yeomin and Dan hanging out together. This sight brought tears to Ban's eyes, and she slammed the door, leaving in distress. When Ban Yeoryeong returned home, she rushed past her brother and collapsed onto her bed, sobbing. Meanwhile, at Dan's house, Baek Yeomin couldn't comprehend what had just occurred. She looked at Dan and asked, "Dan, don't you get annoyed just by looking at Ban?" Dan was unsure of Yeomin's intent. Yeomin continued, suggesting that Ban only acted incredibly nice in front of handsome boys. While it was true that Ban was also pretty, acting overly nice around attractive guys seemed excessive. Yeomin then smiled and proposed that Dan have lunch with her from now on. Dan saw this as the opportunity she had been waiting for, a chance to finally distance herself from Ban. However, she hesitated, thinking that agreeing to have lunch with Yeoman would imply she endorsed everything Yeoman had just said. In a surprising turn of events, Dan found herself defending Ban and saying that Ban wasn't as bad as Yeoman thought. Yeoman didn't expect this response and became annoyed, then left. Dan realized that she had missed her chance to separate from Ban but was also relieved that she hadn't betrayed Ban's trust. She quickly got dressed and went to knock on Ban Yeoryeong's door. To her surprise, Ban's brother answered the door and coldly informed her, Yeoryeong is sleeping. Dan gathered her courage and said, I need to talk to her. Ban's brother fell silent for a moment before asking, Dan, did you make her cry?